You are standing in the year 1799, looking at a France that has passed through 10 years of revolutionary transformation. The absolute monarchy that ruled for centuries has been swept away. The privileges of nobility and clergy have been abolished. A republic has been proclaimed. Yet as you examine this revolutionary France, you discover not stability but exhaustion, not unity but division, not clear direction but uncertainty about what comes next. The revolution began with high hopes and grand declarations. The rights of man proclaimed universal principles of liberty and equality. The National Assembly drafted a constitution meant to transform France into a constitutional monarchy. But the revolution did not stop at moderate reform. Each phase seemed to generate its own momentum, its own logic, pushing events further than anyone initially intended. The constitutional monarchy collapsed when the king was suspected of betraying the revolution. The moderate republic gave way to radical dictatorship. The terror saw thousands sent to the guillotine in the name of defending revolutionary virtue. Then the terror itself was overthrown, and those who had wielded the guillotine found themselves its victims. By 1799, France has cycled through multiple constitutions, multiple governments, multiple visions of what the revolution should accomplish. The current government is the Directory, a 5-member executive committee that has ruled since 1795. The Directory represents an attempt to create stability after the chaos of the Terror, to establish a moderate republic that avoids both monarchist reaction and radical extremism. But the Directory has achieved neither stability nor legitimacy. It is weak, corrupt, increasingly reliant on the army to maintain its position. Elections produce results the Directory does not like, so it annuls them. When political opposition threatens, the Directory calls in troops. This is not the rule of law but the pretense of law maintained by force. You observe that the revolution has created deep divisions within French society. Those who lost property or position during the revolution emigrated nobles, dispossessed clergy, merchants whose businesses were ruined wait for an opportunity to reverse what has been done. They are royalists, hoping for restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. At the other extreme are the radical republicans, those who believe the revolution betrayed its principles by abandoning the social equality promised in the early years. They want to revive the spirit of 1793, to redistribute wealth, to enforce virtue through state power. Between these extremes, most people simply want peace, stability, an end to uncertainty and violence. The wars that began in 1792 continue. France has been fighting much of Europe, Austria, Prussia, Britain, various Italian and German states. Initially, these wars were defensive, as revolutionary France faced monarchies determined to crush this dangerous example of popular sovereignty. But the wars have evolved. French armies no longer merely defend the revolution, they export it, creating sister republics in Italy, Switzerland, the Netherlands. Territory has been annexed. Resources have been extracted. What began as revolutionary defense has become imperial expansion, though no one uses that term yet, since France is officially a republic opposed to empire. These wars have elevated the military to enormous importance. Revolutionary France pioneered mass conscription, the levée en masse, calling all able-bodied men to defend the nation. This created armies larger than Europe had seen before, armies motivated by ideology as much as by pay or coercion. These armies needed officers, and the revolution opened military careers to talent rather than reserving them for nobles. A competent soldier of common birth could rise through the ranks based on ability. This created a new military class, men whose positions depended on the revolution and the wars that justified their authority. Among these military men, certain names have become prominent. Generals who win battles gain political influence. They command loyal troops. They control conquered territories. They accumulate wealth through plunder, officially sanctioned or otherwise. The civilian government in Paris is weak, divided, corrupt. The generals in the field are strong, decisive, backed by veteran soldiers. This creates an obvious imbalance, a situation where the army might decide to impose its own solution to France's political problems. You notice that this dynamic is not unique to France. Throughout history, republics that maintain large standing armies risk military intervention in politics. Roman history provides the template. The late Republic, weakened by internal divisions, saw generals compete for power until one, Julius Caesar and then Augustus, converted military strength into permanent political authority. French revolutionaries are well aware of these precedents. They frequently reference ancient Rome, both as an inspiration for republican virtue and as a warning about how republics can fail. Yet awareness of historical patterns does not prevent those patterns from recurring. The French economy is troubled. The revolutionary governments have experimented with paper currency, the assignats, backed by confiscated church lands. But too much paper money has been printed, and inflation has destroyed its value. The government has returned to metallic currency, but the damage has been done. Trade is disrupted. Business confidence is low. Taxes are difficult to collect because the administrative system is disorganized. The government struggles to pay its soldiers and officials, yet it cannot reduce military expenditures because the wars continue and because the army is needed to maintain domestic order. Religious issues remain contentious. The revolution initially tried to reform the Catholic Church, bringing it under state control through the civil constitution of the clergy. This created a schism between priests who accepted the constitutional church and those who remained loyal to the Pope. The Terror then attempted to de-Christianize France entirely, promoting a cult of reason and a revolutionary calendar that eliminated Christian references. The Directory has ended these extreme policies, but religious life remains unsettled. Many Catholics feel alienated from a government they see as hostile to their faith. The refractory clergy, those who rejected the constitutional church, maintain underground networks and encourage resistance to the revolutionary state. Regional tensions also persist. The Federalist revolts of 1793, when provincial cities resisted Parisian centralization, were suppressed violently. The Vendée region in western France saw a full-scale counter-revolutionary war, with massive casualties on both sides. Though the major rebellions have been crushed, resentment remains. In many areas, people comply with government demands out of fear rather than conviction. The revolution has not created national unity, it has imposed conformity through force, which is not the same thing. As you stand in this moment, you can see that France needs something the Directory cannot provide. The country needs a figure who can end the political instability, who can consolidate the revolutionary gains without endless upheaval, who can make peace or at least win the wars decisively, who can restore confidence in government and currency. The revolution has destroyed the old sources of legitimacy, divine right monarchy, hereditary privilege, traditional hierarchy, but it has not successfully established new sources of legitimacy that command broad acceptance. The Directory's claim to rule rests on a constitution that almost no one respects, maintained by an army that holds the real power. This creates an opening. A sufficiently ambitious and capable individual, particularly one with military credentials and political skill, could step into this vacuum. Such a person would need to appeal to multiple constituencies, to those who want order, to those who want to preserve revolutionary achievements, to those who profit from the wars, to those exhausted by instability. He would need to present himself as the revolution's savior rather than its enemy, as the man who can complete what 1789 began rather than reverse it. He would need to be, or at least to appear, indispensable. In Egypt, leading an expedition meant to strike at British interests in the Mediterranean and threaten British India, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte reads reports from France. He understands that the Directory is failing. He recognizes that opportunity is developing. He has already achieved remarkable military success in Italy, where his campaigns brought France glory and treasure. He has cultivated political connections and public fame. He is ambitious, brilliant, and convinced of his own destiny. The question is not whether France's political crisis will lead to military intervention. The question is which general will act, and when, and with what result. You step backward now to understand how this young officer named Napoleon Bonaparte came to be positioned for power. He was born in 1769 on Corsica, an island that had only recently become French territory. His family belonged to the minor Corsican nobility, respectable but not wealthy. Under the old regime, someone of his background would have had limited prospects. But the revolution changed everything, opening careers to talent, creating opportunities for those willing to seize them. Napoleon received military education in France, attending the military academy at Brienne and then the École Militaire in Paris. He was commissioned as an artillery officer in 1785, when he was only 16. Artillery was a technical branch requiring mathematical skill, less prestigious than cavalry but intellectually demanding. Napoleon studied constantly, reading widely in history, philosophy, and military science. He was not initially remarkable except for his intensity, his capacity for work, his absolute determination to distinguish himself. When the revolution began, Napoleon's sympathies lay with the revolutionary cause. Corsica had been conquered by France, and Corsican patriots, including Napoleon's family, initially hoped the revolution might grant the island independence or at least autonomy. As it became clear that revolutionary France intended to keep Corsica, Napoleon made a choice. He would be French, not Corsican. He would make his career within France, serving the revolution. This pragmatic adaptation to circumstances was characteristic. Napoleon understood how to assess situations and align himself with the winning side. His first significant action came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon. The port city had revolted against the radical government in Paris and admitted British and Spanish forces. The Revolutionary Army besieged the city. Napoleon, a young captain of artillery, was assigned to the siege. He proposed a plan to capture key positions that would force the Allied fleet to evacuate. His plan was adopted, and it succeeded. Toulon was retaken. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at age 24. This was extraordinary, but revolutionary wars rewarded competence quickly. The Revolutionary Army needed capable officers, and those who showed ability advanced rapidly. You observe that Napoleon's rise was facilitated by patronage and political connections as much as by military skill. He associated with Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of Maximilien Robespierre, the leader of the Committee of Public Safety during the Terror. When the Robespierres fell in the Thermidorian reaction, Napoleon was briefly arrested as a suspected Jacobin. But his connections were not deep enough to destroy him, and he was soon released. This taught him a lesson about revolutionary politics. Associations were dangerous, but complete isolation was also dangerous. One needed connections but also flexibility to survive political shifts. In 1795, Napoleon was in Paris, temporarily without a command, when a royalist insurrection threatened the convention. The government needed someone to defend it militarily. Napoleon was given command of the forces defending the convention. He brought in artillery and, on the 13th of Vendémiaire, fired on the royalist insurgents, dispersing them decisively. This action, sometimes called the whiff of grapeshot, saved the Directory government before it officially took power. Napoleon was rewarded with command of the Army of Italy, one of France's major field armies. The Italian campaign of 1796 and 1797 established Napoleon as France's most successful general. He took command of an army that was poorly supplied, demoralized, and facing superior Austrian forces. Through rapid movement, aggressive tactics, and shrewd political management of his subordinates, Napoleon transformed this situation. He defeated Austrian armies in a series of battles, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli. He conquered most of northern Italy, creating French satellite states. He forced Austria to make peace in the Treaty of Campo Formio, a diplomatic triumph negotiated by Napoleon himself, not by civilian officials in Paris. You notice several patterns in Napoleon's Italian campaign that reveal his approach to power. First, he understood the importance of supply and logistics, but he also made his army supply itself through systematic requisitioning from conquered territories. This enriched his soldiers and secured their loyalty while reducing his dependence on the Directory's inadequate supply system. Second, he cultivated his public image, issuing dramatic proclamations and sending reports to Paris that glorified his victories. He became famous throughout France as the brilliant young general who brought victory and treasure. Third, he acted independently of civilian control, making political and diplomatic decisions that should have required approval from Paris but presenting them as accomplished facts. The Directory watched Napoleon's success with mixed feelings. They needed his victories, which gave the government legitimacy and resources. But they also worried about his growing independence and fame. Napoleon was creating a personal power base in Italy, surrounding himself with loyal officers, building relationships with Italian politicians and intellectuals, accumulating wealth through official and unofficial means. He was becoming a political figure, not merely a military commander. After the Italian triumph, Napoleon proposed an expedition to Egypt. Officially, this would strike at British trade routes and threaten British India. Actually, Napoleon saw Egypt as an opportunity to increase his glory and keep himself in the public eye while staying away from Paris's unstable politics. The Directory approved, partly because they believed in the strategic value and partly because they wanted this dangerously popular general far from France. In 1798, Napoleon led an army to Egypt, conquering the country and ruling it as a French possession. The Egyptian expedition was militarily less successful than Italy. Napoleon won battles, including the Battle of the Pyramids, but the British Navy under Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding the French army in Egypt. Napoleon found himself cut off from France, ruling a conquered territory with no clear way to extract his army or achieve broader strategic objectives. Yet he made the most of the situation, organizing the administration of Egypt, sponsoring scientific research, presenting himself as an enlightened ruler bringing civilization to the Orient. While Napoleon was in Egypt, the military and political situation in Europe deteriorated. A second coalition formed against France, Britain, Austria, Russia, various smaller states. French armies suffered defeats. The satellite republics in Italy were threatened. The Directory's authority weakened further. Reports reaching Napoleon in Egypt indicated that France was approaching another political crisis. In August 1799, Napoleon made a decision. He would abandon his army in Egypt, return to France, and seize the opportunity he sensed was developing. You can see in Napoleon's career up to this point a man who combined genuine military brilliance with political ambition and opportunism. He was a gifted tactician who understood how to maneuver armies, concentrate forces at decisive points, and exploit enemy weaknesses. He was also a skilled propagandist who cultivated his reputation through bulletins, proclamations, and careful management of his public image. He was politically astute, understanding when to align with factions and when to maintain independence, when to obey civilian authority and when to act autonomously. Most importantly, Napoleon understood that military success could be converted into political power. The revolution had weakened traditional sources of authority but had not established stable alternatives. In this fluid situation, a general who could claim to embody the revolution's achievements, who could promise both glory abroad and stability at home, who could present himself as indispensable to France's security and prosperity, might accumulate extraordinary power. Napoleon was consciously preparing himself for this role, building the credentials and connections that would allow him to intervene decisively when the moment came. As his ship approached the French coast in October 1799, Napoleon knew that the Directory's days were numbered. The question was what would replace it, and whether he could position himself to shape that replacement. He had military prestige, political connections, and enormous ambition. What he needed was a political vehicle, a civilian faction that would legitimize his intervention and provide the legal framework for a new government. He would find that vehicle in the person of Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, one of the 5 directors, a man who wanted to revise the constitution but lacked the force to impose his will. Together, Napoleon and Sieyès would stage a coup that would transform the revolution and place Napoleon on the path to supreme power. You watch now as Napoleon returns to France in October 1799, landing at Fréjus in the south. His return is illegal. He has abandoned his command in Egypt without authorization. But rather than facing arrest, he receives a hero's welcome. News of his victories in Italy still resonates. People do not yet know the details of the Egyptian situation, the stranded army, the strategic failure. They see only the conquering general returning at a moment when France desperately needs leadership. Napoleon travels to Paris carefully, gauging public opinion, meeting with political figures, assessing opportunities. The Directory is collapsing from within. Of the 5 directors, some want to maintain the current system, others want reform, and none command significant popular support. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the same man who wrote What is the Third Estate 10 years earlier, is now a director convinced that the constitutional structure is flawed. He believes power is too divided, decision-making too slow, the legislative assemblies too prone to faction. Sieyès has been planning a coup to revise the constitution, but he needs military support to ensure success. He has approached other generals, but they are either unwilling or unsuitable. When Napoleon appears, Sieyès sees the solution to his problem. Napoleon and Sieyès negotiate. Sieyès wants a constitutional revision that will create a stronger executive while maintaining a republican framework. Napoleon wants power, though he is careful not to state this too boldly. They agree to work together, each believing he can use the other. Napoleon's brother Lucien, who is president of the Council of 500, one of the legislative bodies, will play a crucial role. Other political figures are recruited: Talleyrand, the foreign minister, Joseph Fouché, the police minister, various legislators who are dissatisfied with the Directory. The conspiracy is poorly kept secret, but the Directory is too weak to act effectively against it. The coup is scheduled for the 18th and 19th of Brumaire, year 8 of the revolutionary calendar, which corresponds to November 9th and 10th, 1799. The plan is to frighten the legislative councils by warning of a Jacobin conspiracy, move them from Paris to St. Cloud for safety, and there pressure them to vote for constitutional changes that will give Sieyès and his allies control. Napoleon will provide military support, his presence and the threat of his soldiers ensuring compliance. On the 18th of Brumaire, the first phase proceeds smoothly. The Council of Elders, the upper house, votes to move to St. Cloud and appoints Napoleon commander of the Paris garrison and the troops assigned to protect the legislature. 3 of the 5 directors resign. The remaining 2 are placed under house arrest. By evening, the Directory has effectively ceased to exist. But the constitutional revision still requires approval from the legislative councils, particularly the Council of 500, which has many committed Republicans who will resist what they recognize as a coup. The next day at St. Cloud, Napoleon enters the Council of Elders to explain the situation and demand their cooperation. He speaks poorly, unlike his carefully crafted proclamations. He seems nervous, even confused. The deputies sense weakness and begin to question him sharply. What is this alleged conspiracy? What gives him the right to make demands? Napoleon's performance is so ineffective that some historians later suspect it was deliberate, a way to appear reluctant and driven by circumstances rather than by ambition. Whether calculated or genuine, his poor showing before the elders leaves the situation unresolved. Then Napoleon goes to address the Council of 500. This is a mistake. These deputies are more radical, more suspicious of military intervention. When Napoleon enters, they surround him, shouting accusations. Some physically push him. There are cries of "outlaw him." The same parliamentary procedure used against Robespierre, which led directly to his execution. For a moment, the coup seems to be failing. Napoleon is hustled out of the chamber by his officers, possibly in actual danger. You observe that this moment reveals the importance of supporting actors in historical events. Napoleon Bonaparte, presiding over the Council of 500, refuses to put the motion to outlaw his brother to a vote. He leaves the chamber and joins Napoleon outside. Together with other officers, they decide on a more direct approach. Troops are ordered to clear the legislative chamber. Soldiers enter with fixed bayonets. The deputies flee, some jumping out windows. By evening, a rump session of compliant legislators is assembled. They vote to dissolve the Directory and the current legislative system, creating a provisional government of 3 consuls with Napoleon as first consul. The coup succeeds, but barely. It was poorly planned, almost botched in execution, rescued by Napoleon's military prestige and by the willingness of soldiers to obey him rather than civilian authorities. The ease with which armed force swept aside legislative opposition reveals the weakness of republican institutions in France. 10 years of revolution have not created a political system that can resist military intervention. The army, which was supposed to serve the Republic, has become the arbiter of political power. The new government calls itself the Consulate, a term borrowed from ancient Rome. There are 3 consuls, but the first among them, Napoleon, holds the real power. Sieyes drafts a new constitution, the Constitution of Year 8, which creates a complex system meant to balance participation with stability. There are multiple legislative bodies with limited powers, a Senate that supposedly represents continuity, and an elaborate electoral system that gives voters the appearance of participation while actually concentrating power in the hands of the consuls and their appointees. Napoleon accepts this constitutional framework but immediately begins to modify it in practice. He is first consul for 10 years, with powers to propose legislation, command the army, conduct diplomacy, and appoint officials. Sieyes, the second consul, and Roger Ducos, the third, have only advisory roles. Within months, Napoleon has marginalized them entirely. The consulate is his government, whatever the constitutional formalities might suggest. You see that the consulate represents a transformation of the revolution. The rhetoric remains republican. Napoleon speaks of defending revolutionary principles, of preserving the gains of 1789, of preventing both royalist reaction and Jacobin extremism. But the substance is authoritarian. Napoleon concentrates power systematically, creating a strong centralized government that reduces the chaotic factionalism of previous revolutionary regimes but also eliminates meaningful political participation. Elections continue, but they are managed. Legislative bodies still meet, but they rubber-stamp government proposals. Opposition is tolerated only within narrow limits. This transformation is welcomed by many French people. The constant instability of the Directory years has exhausted public appetite for politics. People want effective government, security, prosperity. If achieving these requires accepting authoritarian rule under a military leader, many are willing to make that trade. Napoleon understands this mood and exploits it. He presents himself as the man who can end the revolution's chaos while preserving its achievements, who can provide both order and progress. Internationally, France remains at war with the Second Coalition. Austria and Britain continue to fight. Napoleon's first priority as first consul is to demonstrate military competence and secure France's position. In the spring of 1800, he leads an army across the Alps into Italy, replicating his earlier Italian campaign. At the Battle of Marengo in June, Napoleon defeats the Austrians, though the battle is closer than his official accounts later claim. The victory allows Napoleon to reconquer northern Italy and force Austria to negotiate. By February 1801, Austria signs the Treaty of Luneville, accepting French dominance in Italy and the Rhineland. Britain remains at war, but both sides are exhausted. Negotiations lead to the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802, establishing a temporary peace. For the first time in a decade, France is not at war with any major European power. Napoleon can claim credit for achieving what the Directory could not: victory abroad and peace. This military success, combined with his growing control of domestic government, strengthens his position enormously. As 1801 begins, Napoleon has been in power for little more than a year, yet he has already altered France's political trajectory fundamentally. The revolution has not been reversed. There is no restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, no return of noble privileges, no revival of the Ancien regime's social hierarchy. But the revolution has been contained, directed, subordinated to the authority of a single leader who claims to embody its principles while actually exercising power that resembles enlightened despotism more than republican government. The stage is set for Napoleon to consolidate his authority further, to reform French institutions according to his vision, and ultimately to transform his position from temporary consul to permanent ruler. You turn your attention now to the domestic transformation Napoleon engineers during the consulate. Military victories provide legitimacy and security, but lasting power requires institutional foundations. Napoleon understands that revolutionary France needs stable administration, clear laws, and functioning institutions. He sets about creating these with the same systematic approach he applies to military campaigns. The goal is to make himself indispensable by making his government effective. The first priority is financial stabilization. Revolutionary governments struggled constantly with revenue, unable to collect taxes effectively, dependent on inflation and confiscation. Napoleon creates the Bank of France in 1800, establishing a central financial institution that can manage currency and provide credit. He appoints capable administrators to reform tax collection, not raising rates dramatically but ensuring that what is owed is actually collected. Systematic assessment, professional tax collectors, and reduction of corruption gradually improve state finances. This is not revolutionary in method, it resembles the reforms that Ancien regime finance ministers attempted, but it succeeds where they failed because Napoleon has the political authority to overcome resistance. Administrative reform extends throughout government. Napoleon creates the system of prefects, government officials appointed to oversee each of France's departments. The prefects answer directly to the central government, not to local interests. They implement national policy, collect taxes, maintain order, report on local conditions. This creates a uniform administrative structure across France, eliminating the regional variation that characterized the old regime and that persisted even during the Revolution. The prefects make France, for the first time, truly centrally governed. The judicial system also receives Napoleon's attention. One of the revolution's promises was rational, uniform law replacing the patchwork of customary laws, royal edicts, and traditional privileges. Various revolutionary assemblies attempted to codify French law but never completed the task. Napoleon makes this a priority. He appoints a commission of legal experts and personally participates in the discussions. The result is the Civil Code, promulgated in 1804, later known as the Napoleonic Code. This document establishes clear, uniform rules for property, contracts, inheritance, and family relations across all of France. You observe that the Civil Code represents a particular vision of social order. It preserves revolutionary achievements by confirming the abolition of feudalism, establishing equality before the law, and protecting property rights. But it also reflects conservative values, particularly regarding family structure. The code strengthens paternal authority within the family. It restricts women's legal rights, requiring wives to obey husbands and limiting their control over property. It prohibits investigations of paternity for children born outside marriage, protecting men from claims by former mistresses or servants. The code creates a legal framework that is modern in eliminating inherited privilege but traditional in maintaining patriarchal authority. Education reform follows similar patterns. Napoleon establishes the lycées, state secondary schools meant to train future administrators and officers. Education is standardized, with uniform curriculum emphasizing mathematics, science, classics, and French language and culture. The goal is not universal education. Primary schooling remains limited, but rather creation of a capable administrative class loyal to the state and trained in useful knowledge. Napoleon wants engineers, bureaucrats, and officers, not philosophers or political theorists. Education serves state purposes, producing competent servants of centralized authority. Religious policy proves more complex. The Revolution's attempt to subordinate the Catholic Church created lasting divisions. Constitutional clergy and refractory clergy remained at odds. Many Catholics felt alienated from a government they saw as hostile to faith. Napoleon recognizes that religious peace is necessary for social stability. In 1801, he negotiates the Concordat with Pope Pius VII. This agreement re-established the Catholic Church in France, but under terms favorable to state authority. The Church recognizes the legitimacy of property confiscations during the Revolution, abandoning claims to former Church lands. In return, the state pays clerical salaries and recognizes Catholicism as the religion of the majority of Frenchmen, not the state religion, but the religion of most citizens. The Concordat achieves several objectives simultaneously. It reconciles most Catholics to the government, eliminating a major source of opposition. It subordinates the Church to state control, since bishops are appointed by the government and clergy receive state salaries. It preserves religious tolerance, maintaining legal recognition for Protestants and Jews while giving the Catholic Church special status. Like much of Napoleon's domestic policy, the Concordat balances competing interests, giving something to everyone while ensuring that ultimate authority remains with the state. You notice that Napoleon's reforms systematically strengthen central authority while presenting themselves as rational improvements. Each change makes sense on its own terms: more efficient tax collection, clearer laws, better schools, religious peace. Collectively, they create a state apparatus that reaches into every corner of French life, administered by professionals loyal to Napoleon's government. There is nothing mysterious about this process. It is methodical, pragmatic, focused on making government work effectively according to traditional standards of administrative competence. Opposition to Napoleon's consolidation of power exists but remains fragmented. Royalists hope for Bourbon restoration but are weak and divided. Jacobins want to revive revolutionary radicalism but have been discredited by the Terror's memory. Liberal Republicans who supported the revolution's moderate goals find themselves uncomfortable with Napoleon's authoritarianism but unable to propose alternatives that command broad support. Napoleon manages opposition through a combination of co-optation, surveillance, and selective repression. Joseph Fouché, the Minister of Police, runs an extensive surveillance network. Informants report on political conversations in cafes, salons, and even private homes. Opposition figures find themselves monitored. Those deemed dangerous might be arrested, exiled to remote provinces, or simply intimidated into silence. But repression is calibrated. Napoleon does not create mass terror. He targets specific threats while allowing most people to live peacefully if they avoid political activity. This selective repression is more effective than indiscriminate violence. It eliminates serious opposition while maintaining the appearance of a government that respects law and order. The press comes under increasing control. Newspapers require licenses. Critical publications lose their permits. Editors understand that excessive criticism will result in closure. Official bulletins and government-friendly newspapers dominate public discourse. Napoleon pays attention to his public image, ensuring favorable coverage and suppressing negative reports. This is not total censorship. Private correspondence remains relatively free, and people discuss politics in private, but public political discourse is managed to support government narratives. Economic policy focuses on stability and growth. Napoleon protects French manufacturing through tariffs, limiting British competition. He invests in infrastructure, roads, canals, bridges, facilitating internal trade and military movement. He encourages industrial development, awarding prizes for technical innovations and providing subsidies for strategic industries. These policies favor producers and merchants over consumers, and they assume that state intervention in economic matters is proper and necessary. Napoleon is no advocate of laissez-faire. He believes government should direct economic activity toward national objectives. As 1802 progresses, Napoleon's position strengthens continuously. Military victory, administrative competence, and political control combine to make him appear indispensable. France is functioning more smoothly than at any point since the revolution began. The economy is recovering. The administration is effective. The legal system is being rationalized. Religious conflicts are being resolved. For many French people, these improvements justify accepting Napoleon's growing personal power. They believe he is using authority wisely, that his dictatorship is benevolent, that he truly serves France's interests rather than merely his own ambition. Yet you can see that this consolidation has an internal logic that points toward further concentration of power. Each reform strengthens the state and Napoleon's control over it. Each success increases his prestige and makes opposition seem unpatriotic or destructive. Each institutional change creates vested interests, administrators, judges, teachers, clergy, whose positions depend on the continuation of his government. Napoleon is building a system that can function without him in theory, but that in practice is designed to make his removal extremely difficult and destabilizing. The question is not whether he will accumulate more power, but how far he will take this accumulation, and what form his authority will ultimately assume. You observe that by 1802, Napoleon's authority is immense, yet it remains constitutionally temporary. The Constitution of Year 8 made him first consul for 10 years. This implies that his position will eventually end, that France will need to select new leadership. Napoleon has no intention of allowing this. He wants permanent power, but he wants it granted through forms that appear legitimate, that suggest popular will rather than naked usurpation. The transformation from temporary consul to permanent ruler will be accomplished gradually, through a series of constitutional changes presented as responding to public demand. In May 1802, a proposal emerges to extend Napoleon's term as first consul. The Senate, which Napoleon has packed with loyal appointees, votes to submit the question to a plebiscite. The question posed to French voters is whether Napoleon Bonaparte should be consul for life. This is not a genuine democratic choice. The government controls the voting process, influences public opinion through the press, and makes clear what answer it expects. Nevertheless, presenting the question to the people provides a veneer of legitimacy. The plebiscite takes place in August 1802. Officially, more than 3.5 million voters approve making Napoleon consul for life, with fewer than 9,000 opposing. These numbers are certainly manipulated, but the underlying reality is that many French people do support Napoleon. He has brought stability, victory, and effective government. The chaos of the Directory years is recent memory. Most people are willing to accept permanent rule by a successful leader rather than risk a return to instability. The result is announced with great ceremony. Napoleon is now consul for life, his position no longer temporary. Being consul for life gives Napoleon permanent power, but it does not fully satisfy his ambition or address questions of succession. What happens when he dies? Will there be another power struggle? Will the Republic revert to instability? Napoleon wants to establish hereditary rule, ensuring that his power passes to his heirs. But how to accomplish this in a country that violently overthrew hereditary monarchy only 13 years ago? The solution will require careful preparation and skillful presentation. The pretext arrives in 1804 when police discover a royalist conspiracy to assassinate Napoleon. The conspiracy is real, though its chances of success are doubtful. Napoleon uses it to justify eliminating potential rivals and to argue that his personal security is inseparable from France's stability. In a controversial action, Napoleon orders the arrest of the Duc d'Enghien, a Bourbon prince living in Baden, just across the French border. D'Enghien is kidnapped, brought to France, tried by military commission, and executed. This judicial murder shocks Europe, particularly other monarchs who see it as a violation of international norms. But domestically, it demonstrates Napoleon's ruthlessness and eliminates a potential rallying point for royalists. You notice that the execution of the Duc d'Enghien serves another purpose. It makes clear that there will be no Bourbon restoration, that Napoleon is irreversibly opposed to the old royal family. This pushes France toward accepting an alternative monarchical solution if monarchy provides stability, and if the Bourbons are permanently excluded, then perhaps Napoleon himself should become monarch. This is the logic his supporters begin to articulate publicly. Throughout 1804, a campaign develops for transforming the consulate into an empire. Senate members, appointed officials, generals, and coordinated petitions from local bodies all call for making Napoleon emperor. These requests are not spontaneous, they are orchestrated by Napoleon's government, but they provide political cover. Napoleon can claim to be responding to popular will rather than seizing power unilaterally. The Senate votes to establish an empire with Napoleon as hereditary emperor. Another plebiscite follows, again producing an overwhelming but certainly manipulated majority in favor. On December 2, 1804, Napoleon crowns himself Emperor of the French in an elaborate ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Pope Pius VII is present, lending religious legitimacy to the event, though Napoleon famously takes the crown from the Pope's hands and places it on his own head, symbolizing that his authority is not dependent on papal approval. Josephine, his wife, is crowned empress. The ceremony deliberately echoes Charlemagne's coronation 1,000 years earlier, connecting Napoleon to European imperial tradition while distinguishing his empire from the Bourbon monarchy. The transformation from first consul to emperor involves more than changing titles. A new constitution, the Constitution of Year 12, establishes formal imperial structures. An imperial court is created with grand dignitaries, marshals, chamberlains, masters of ceremonies. Napoleon creates a new nobility, not based on birth but on service. He awards titles, Duke, Count, Baron, to successful generals, administrators, and loyal supporters. These titles carry financial endowments and can be inherited, but only if descendants continue to serve the state effectively. This is meritocratic nobility, rewarding achievement while creating hereditary advantages. You observe that Napoleon's empire represents a peculiar hybrid. It preserves revolutionary achievements, equality before the law, abolition of feudal privilege, careers open to talent. The civil code remains in force. The administrative system continues unchanged. Religious tolerance is maintained. Yet politically, France has returned to monarchy, albeit a monarchy that claims revolutionary legitimacy. Napoleon presents his empire as completing the revolution, as providing the stable, effective government that the revolution promised but could not deliver through republican forms. This ideological positioning is crucial. Napoleon does not present himself as a counter-revolutionary. He insists that he is the revolution's heir, that his empire embodies revolutionary principles while avoiding revolutionary chaos. He appeals to those who value the revolution's social and legal achievements but who want order and authority. This allows him to attract support from diverse constituencies, from former Jacobins who accept that circumstances require strong leadership, from moderate Republicans who prioritize stability, from former nobles and clergy who prefer Napoleon's empire to Jacobin radicalism, from peasants who care primarily about keeping the land they acquired during the revolution. The creation of the empire raises questions about succession. Napoleon and Josephine have no children together, though each has children from previous relationships. Initially, Napoleon's succession plans focus on his stepson or on his brothers. But he increasingly considers divorcing Josephine to marry someone who can provide direct heirs. For now, the succession is established as hereditary within the Bonaparte family, with Napoleon's brothers Joseph and Louis in the line of succession. This ensures dynastic continuity but leaves specifics ambiguous. European reactions to Napoleon's coronation are mixed. Some monarchs, particularly those who have made peace with France, send congratulations and recognize the new empire. Others, especially Britain, refuse recognition and see Napoleon's imperial title as further evidence of his boundless ambition. Russia and Austria watch warily, uncertain whether to accommodate or resist this upstart emperor. The transformation from republic to empire signals to Europe that France under Napoleon is not returning to revolutionary radicalism but is becoming a traditional great power, albeit one led by a military genius with conquests in mind. As 1805 begins, Napoleon has achieved a remarkable transformation. 13 years after the monarchy was overthrown, France again has an emperor. But this is not a restoration. The Bonapartist Empire is new, based on revolutionary foundations, claiming revolutionary legitimacy, preserving revolutionary social structures. It represents the revolution's transformation from attempt at republican government to acceptance of authoritarian rule under a successful military leader. The question now becomes what Napoleon will do with the imperial authority he has constructed, how he will use power to reshape Europe, and whether his empire can endure or will prove as unstable as the regimes that preceded it. You examine now the structure of power Napoleon creates within his empire. Having assumed the title of emperor, he must build institutions that translate personal authority into systematic governance. The empire cannot function simply through Napoleon's charisma or military reputation. It requires bureaucracy, hierarchy, legal frameworks, and mechanisms for transmitting imperial will throughout France and eventually throughout the territories Napoleon controls. The Senate, the legislative bodies, and the Council of State continue to exist, but their roles become increasingly ceremonial. The Senate confirms imperial decisions rather than deliberating independently. The legislative bodies receive bills from the government and vote approval with minimal debate. The Council of State, where Napoleon personally presides over important sessions, becomes the real center of legislative drafting and administrative coordination. Napoleon works intensely with the Council, participating in discussions of technical details, insisting on clarity and precision in legal language. He wants laws that are enforceable and unambiguous, not aspirational declarations that mean different things to different people. The imperial administration expands and becomes more sophisticated. The prefects in each department are complemented by sub-prefects at lower levels. A hierarchy of inspectors monitors government operations. The Ministry of Interior coordinates domestic administration. The Ministry of Police, under Fouché, maintains surveillance and suppresses opposition. The Ministry of War manages the enormous military establishment. The Ministry of Finance collects revenue and manages expenditure. Each ministry operates under Napoleon's oversight, with ministers serving at his pleasure and implementing policies he determines. You notice that Napoleon involves himself in remarkable detail across government functions. He reads reports from prefects describing local conditions. He reviews architectural plans for public buildings. He makes decisions about appointments to minor positions. He insists on seeing financial accounts. This micromanagement reflects both his extraordinary capacity for work and his distrust of delegating important decisions. He believes that effective governance requires the leader to understand details, that generals who rely entirely on staff officers lose touch with reality. The same principle applies to political leadership. Napoleon wants to know what is actually happening, not just what officials tell him is happening. The imperial court becomes an instrument of political control as much as a symbol of grandeur. Napoleon creates elaborate protocols governing access to the emperor, establishing a hierarchy of intimacy. Those with regular access, ministers, chamberlains, military aides, form an inner circle with enormous influence. Those relegated to occasional formal audiences have much less ability to shape policy. Napoleon uses these gradations of access to reward loyalty and manage competition among his subordinates. He plays favorites, creates rivalries, ensures that no one beside himself becomes indispensable. The new imperial nobility serves several functions. Titles reward successful generals and administrators, providing them with social status that costs the state nothing immediately, since titles in themselves are merely honorific. But Napoleon also endows many titles with landed estates, particularly estates confiscated in conquered territories. This creates a nobility with material interests in maintaining French territorial gains. A marshal who holds lands in Italy or the Rhineland has personal reasons to support French dominance in those regions. The new nobility thus becomes a political base for empire, with fortunes tied to Napoleon's continued success. Education under the empire emphasizes loyalty and utility. The lycées produce young men trained in mathematics, science, classics, and administration. The curriculum includes moral instruction stressing duty, honor, and service to the state. Napoleon wants an educated class that is competent but not politically troublesome, that understands technical subjects but accepts existing authority. The university system is reorganized as a centralized imperial university with standardized curricula. Private schools are regulated. Religious schools are permitted but monitored. Education becomes an instrument for shaping citizens who will serve the empire effectively. Censorship and propaganda become more systematic. The number of newspapers in Paris is reduced to a handful, all subject to government approval of content. Provincial newspapers receive official articles that they are required to publish. Books require approval before publication, with politically suspect works banned. Theatre productions are monitored for subversive content. At the same time, official publications glorify Napoleon's achievements. Books describing his campaigns appear, often written by government employees using official records. Paintings depict him as a classical hero. Monuments commemorate his victories. Public ceremonies celebrate imperial anniversaries. This is comprehensive management of public opinion, more sophisticated than simple repression because it actively shapes how people think about politics rather than merely silencing criticism. The legal system reflects Napoleon's vision of order. The Civil Code provides uniform private law. Additional codes follow: the Code of Civil Procedure, the Commercial Code, the Criminal Code, the Code of Criminal Procedure. These codes rationalize French law, eliminating regional variations and creating clarity. but they also reflect authoritarian assumptions. Criminal procedure gives prosecutors and police substantial power relative to defendants. Judges are appointed by the emperor and serve at his pleasure, reducing judicial independence. The codes protect property and enforce contracts, providing security for commerce and investment. They do not, however, protect political rights. Freedom of speech, assembly, and press exist only within limits the government determines. You observe that the empire's domestic system combines modern administrative techniques with traditional authoritarian control. It is rational in the sense of being systematic, predictable, and efficient. It is modern in its emphasis on meritocracy, technical education, and uniform legal standards. But it is not liberal. It does not embrace political participation, representative government, or protection of individual rights against state power. It represents enlightened despotism updated for the post-revolutionary world, government that serves public purposes but does so through centralized authority unchecked by constitutional limits. Financially, the empire functions more successfully than revolutionary governments but remains dependent on war. Tax revenue improves through better collection, but it is never sufficient to cover the military expenditures Napoleon incurs. The difference is made up through contributions extracted from conquered territories. Italy, the Rhineland, and other occupied regions pay tribute, supply French armies, and provide plunder for French generals. This creates a perverse incentive. The empire's financial stability depends on continued military success and territorial expansion. Peace would force France to reduce military spending or raise taxes, either of which would be politically difficult. War, if successful, pays for itself and more. The relationship between the emperor and the army is central to the entire system. Napoleon is, first and foremost, a military leader. His legitimacy rests on military success. The army is loyal to him personally, not to abstract principles or institutions. Soldiers receive rewards, plunder, promotions, titles. Officers become marshals and dukes. The military is privileged within the empire, its needs given priority over civilian concerns. This military orientation shapes everything. France under Napoleon is a country organized for war, with governmental structures designed to mobilize resources and manpower for military purposes. As you consider the empire's domestic structure, you recognize that Napoleon has created something historically significant. He has shown that revolutionary social changes can be preserved within an authoritarian political framework. The legal equality established by the revolution continues under the empire. The abolition of feudalism is not reversed. Careers remain open to talent. Property rights are secure. But political participation is eliminated. Authority is concentrated in a single ruler. Opposition is suppressed. This combination, social modernity with political authoritarianism, will influence European political development for generations. Napoleon demonstrates that revolution does not necessarily lead to democracy, that it can instead produce a more efficient form of autocracy, one that claims revolutionary legitimacy while exercising traditional absolute power. You turn your attention outward now to Napoleon's military campaigns and his attempt to reshape Europe according to his vision. The Peace of Amiens, which temporarily ended war with Britain in 1802, collapses by 1803. Britain, alarmed by French expansion and commercial dominance, refuses to evacuate Malta as the treaty required. Napoleon responds by preparing an invasion of Britain, assembling an army and a fleet at Boulogne on the Channel coast. But the invasion never occurs. British naval supremacy, confirmed at the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, where Admiral Nelson defeats the combined French and Spanish fleets, makes crossing the Channel impossibly risky. Unable to invade Britain, Napoleon turns his attention to the continent. Austria and Russia, alarmed by French expansion and encouraged by British subsidies, form the Third Coalition against France. Napoleon responds with characteristic decisiveness. In a brilliant campaign in the autumn of 1805, he marches the army of Boulogne rapidly eastward, surrounds an Austrian army at Ulm, and forces its surrender. He then advances on Vienna, capturing the Austrian capital. On December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon wins his greatest victory at Austerlitz, defeating a combined Austrian and Russian army. The Battle of Austerlitz demonstrates Napoleon's military genius at its peak. He deliberately weakens his right flank, luring the Allied army to attack there. When they commit their forces to this sector, Napoleon counterattacks in the center, breaking their line and shattering their army. The Austrians sue for peace. The Russians retreat eastward. The Third Coalition collapses. Napoleon imposes the Treaty of Pressburg on Austria, stripping it of Italian and German territories. Austrian influence in Germany is broken. Napoleon reorganizes German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, a French satellite that formally ends the Holy Roman Empire after more than 1,000 years of nominal existence. You observe that Napoleon's military successes after 1805 are not merely victories but instruments of political reorganization. He does not simply defeat enemies and return to France. He uses military victory to redraw the map of Europe, creating satellite states, placing relatives on thrones, extending French administrative and legal systems into conquered territories. The Napoleonic Empire becomes a system spanning the continent, with France at the center and subordinate states orbiting around it. In 1806, Prussia, alarmed by French dominance in Germany, enters the war. Napoleon destroys the Prussian army in twin battles at Jena and Austerlitz, conquers Berlin, and pursues the Prussians into Poland. The Russians come to Prussia's aid, but Napoleon defeats them at Friedland in June 1807. Tsar Alexander I, recognizing that continued war serves no purpose, meets Napoleon at Tilsit and negotiates a comprehensive settlement. The treaties of Tilsit divide Europe into French and Russian spheres of influence. Prussia is drastically reduced in size. A new French satellite state, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, is created from Prussian and Austrian Poland. Russia accepts French dominance in Western and Central Europe. France and Russia become nominal allies. By 1807, Napoleon dominates the European continent to an extent not seen since Roman times. His empire includes not just France but annexed territories along the Rhine, in northern Italy, and on the Adriatic coast. French armies occupy Prussia, Austria, Spain, and Portugal. Satellite kingdoms ruled by Napoleon's relatives exist in Italy, Holland, and Westphalia. Allied states like Bavaria and Saxony follow French policy. Only Britain, protected by naval power, and Russia, too distant to conquer, remain independent of French control. Napoleon attempts to extend his dominance economically through the continental system, a comprehensive blockade designed to exclude British goods from Europe. Since France cannot invade Britain, Napoleon reasons, economic strangulation might force British surrender. He prohibits trade with Britain throughout the territory he controls. Neutral ships entering European ports must prove they have not come from Britain or British colonies. Smuggled British goods are confiscated and burned. The continental system aims to destroy British commerce, reduce British wealth, and force the British government to make peace. The continental system creates economic distortion and hardship. European industries benefit from reduced British competition, but consumers face higher prices and reduced choice. Smuggling flourishes as merchants evade the blockade to profit from demand for British goods. Enforcement requires constant vigilance and substantial administrative effort. Countries dependent on maritime trade suffer particularly. Russia, for instance, needs to export grain and import manufactured goods. The continental system disrupts these patterns and creates Russian resentment of the French alliance. You notice that the continental system reveals limitations of Napoleon's power. He can conquer territory and defeat armies, but he cannot fully control economic behavior. People find ways around restrictions. Local authorities, even in French-controlled territories, sometimes look the other way when smuggling occurs because they benefit from the resulting trade. The continental system becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, requiring ever more coercive enforcement and generating ever more resistance. Military occupation of Spain illustrates the problems of overextension. In 1807, Napoleon pressures the Spanish monarchy to allow French troops to cross Spain to invade Portugal, which refuses to enforce the continental system. By 1808, Napoleon has replaced the Spanish Bourbon dynasty with his brother Joseph, making Spain a French satellite. But the Spanish people reject foreign rule. Guerrilla warfare erupts across Spain, tying down hundreds of thousands of French troops. British forces under Wellington land in Portugal and cannot be dislodged. The Peninsular War, as this conflict becomes known, bleeds the French military for years, draining resources and demonstrating that Napoleon cannot simply impose his will on unwilling populations. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon calls it, is compounded by growing tensions with Russia. Tsar Alexander initially accepts the Tilsit arrangement but becomes increasingly dissatisfied. The continental system damages Russian trade. French support for Polish nationalism worries Russia, which controls much of former Poland. Napoleon's annexation of additional German territory in 1809 and 1810 extends French power eastward, closer to Russian borders. By 1811, it is clear that the Franco-Russian alliance is failing. Both sides begin preparing for war. As you observe European affairs in the years after Austerlitz, you see Napoleon achieving military dominance that proves difficult to sustain. Each victory requires occupation or satellite governments. Each satellite requires French troops to maintain. The Grand Army, the massive military force Napoleon commands, is increasingly spread across Europe, in Spain, in Germany, in Poland, in Italy. Maintaining this empire requires constant military effort. Any relaxation of force invites rebellion or defection. The empire is strong militarily but structurally unstable, dependent on continued success to maintain cohesion. Moreover, Napoleon's dominance generates inevitable resistance. European states accommodate French power when necessary but resent subordination. Intellectuals and nationalists begin articulating opposition to French imperialism in national terms. Germans resent French occupation and begin developing concepts of German national identity in opposition to French universalism. The same occurs in Italy and elsewhere. Napoleon's empire, which claims to spread revolutionary principles of liberty and equality, is experienced by many Europeans as foreign tyranny. This gap between French self-perception and European reality creates political tensions that will ultimately contribute to the empire's collapse. You examine how Napoleon attempts to govern the vast territories under his control. Military conquest is one thing, administrative integration is another. Napoleon approaches imperial administration with the same systematic attention he applies to military operations. His goal is not simply to dominate Europe militarily but to extend French administrative, legal, and cultural systems across the continent, creating a unified European order under French leadership. In territories directly annexed to France, the Rhineland, Piedmont, Tuscany, the Illyrian provinces along the Adriatic, French law and administration are imposed wholesale. These regions become French departments, governed by French prefects, subject to the Civil Code and the other Napoleonic codes. French replaces local languages in official business. Young men from these territories are conscripted into the French army. Taxes are collected according to French systems. The intention is to integrate these territories so thoroughly that they become indistinguishable from France proper. The satellite kingdoms, Naples, Spain, Holland, Westphalia, Berg, receive a modified version of French systems. Napoleon's relatives and trusted generals rule these kingdoms. They receive constitutions modeled on French imperial structures. They adopt versions of the Napoleonic codes. They abolish feudalism and establish legal equality. They create administrative systems based on French models. These reforms are presented as modernization, as bringing the benefits of French civilization to backward regions. In practice, they serve French interests by making satellite states more efficiently exploitable for military and financial purposes. You observe that these administrative reforms generate complex responses. Some people, particularly professionals and urban middle classes, welcome the reforms. The abolition of feudalism benefits peasants. Legal equality opens careers to talent. Improved administration reduces arbitrary local power. These groups see French rule, despite its foreign character, as progressive compared to the old regime institutions it replaces. But others resent the reforms precisely because they are foreign imposed. Local elites lose traditional privileges. Regional autonomy is destroyed. National cultures are subordinated to French universalism. The reforms create beneficiaries and opponents simultaneously. The conscription system extends across the empire, providing Napoleon with massive armies. France itself supplies the core of military manpower, but satellite states and annexed territories must contribute increasingly large contingents. Italian, German, Polish, and Dutch soldiers fight in French armies, often far from their homes, in campaigns that serve French interests. This military burden grows heavier as the wars continue. By 1812, the Grand Army preparing to invade Russia includes barely half French soldiers, the rest are from across the empire. This multinational force testifies to the empire's extent but also to its fragility. These soldiers' loyalty to Napoleon and France is conditional, dependent on success and reward. The economic integration of the empire serves French interests explicitly. Napoleon protects French industry through tariffs while opening satellite markets to French goods. Raw materials flow from conquered territories to France. Manufacturing develops in France while satellites remain suppliers of agricultural products and raw materials. This mercantilist approach treats the empire as an economic system meant to enrich France, not to develop all regions equally. The satellite states accept this arrangement not because they benefit but because they cannot resist. Cultural policy under the empire combines promotion of French language and values with tolerance of local cultures within limits. French becomes the language of administration and high culture throughout the empire. French-style salons and theaters are established in major cities. French art and architecture are promoted. Yet local languages survive in private use, and local customs continue in daily life. Napoleon is not attempting cultural genocide but rather cultural hegemony, making French dominant while allowing subordinate cultures to persist as provincial variations. The legal reforms export revolutionary principles in modified form. The abolition of feudalism spreads across Europe. Equality before the law becomes the norm in French-controlled territories. Jewish emancipation, established in France during the Revolution, extends to many parts of the empire. Guild restrictions are eliminated, opening trade. These changes modernize European societies, breaking down medieval structures and replacing them with rational legal frameworks. Some historians argue that Napoleon, despite his authoritarianism, spread progressive reforms that advanced European development. Others emphasize that these reforms were imposed by conquest and served imperial purposes. You notice that the empire's administration requires enormous effort and generates constant problems. Local resistance must be suppressed. Collaborators must be rewarded and protected. Smuggling and black markets must be combated. Revenue must be extracted while maintaining enough prosperity to prevent total collapse. Officials must be recruited, trained, and monitored. All of this requires bureaucracy, police, and military forces. The administrative costs of empire are substantial, offsetting some of the wealth extracted from conquered territories. Napoleon himself remains at the center of this vast system. He reads reports from across the empire, makes major decisions, and communicates detailed instructions to subordinates. His work habits are legendary. He sleeps little, works through the night, dictates correspondence at tremendous speed. He maintains personal control over military, diplomatic, and administrative matters simultaneously. This centralization is both a strength and a weakness. It ensures coherent policy and rapid decision-making, but it also creates a bottleneck. Everything important must pass through Napoleon, and his capacity, however great, has limits. The succession question becomes increasingly urgent as the empire expands. Napoleon and Josephine divorce in 1809 so Napoleon can remarry and father legitimate heirs. He marries Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, creating a dynastic alliance with one of Europe's oldest ruling houses. In 1811, Marie-Louise gives birth to a son, Napoleon II, titled the King of Rome. Napoleon has his heir, ensuring dynastic succession. But the boy's future depends entirely on his father's continued success. If Napoleon falls, his son's claims will be worthless. By 1812, the Napoleonic Empire has reached its greatest territorial extent. It includes France, the annexed territories, the satellite kingdoms, and the Allied states compelled to follow French policy. This empire is unprecedented in European history since Rome. Yet it is also inherently unstable. It depends on military force to maintain. It generates resistance through its very existence. It strains French resources through constant warfare and occupation. The question is not whether it can endure indefinitely, clearly it cannot, but rather when and how it will collapse, and what consequences that collapse will have for France and Europe. As you observe the empire in 1812, you see an administrative achievement combined with political fragility. Napoleon has demonstrated that a single individual of extraordinary ability can construct an empire through military genius and administrative skill. He has spread French law and institutions across Europe. He has modernized backward societies and broken feudal structures. But he has also created enemies who await opportunities for revenge, exhausted France's resources, and built a system that cannot outlast its creator. The empire is magnificent and doomed simultaneously, a monument to one man's will and a warning about the limits of individual power. You watch now as the continental system's strain leads to the final breakdown of the Franco-Russian alliance. By 1812, Tsar Alexander has effectively abandoned the blockade against Britain. Russian ports admit British goods. Russian grain flows to Britain. Napoleon cannot tolerate this defiance. The continental system's credibility depends on enforcement. If Russia can ignore it with impunity, other states will follow. Napoleon decides that Russia must be brought back into line through military force. The decision to invade Russia is arguably Napoleon's greatest strategic error, but from his perspective in early 1812, it appears logical. Russia is diplomatically isolated. France commands the resources of most of Europe. The Grand Army assembled for the invasion numbers over 600,000 men, the largest European army yet assembled. Previous enemies, Austria and Prussia, have been forced to contribute troops. Napoleon expects a campaign similar to Austerlitz or Friedland. He will advance into Russia, defeat the Russian army in a decisive battle, impose a treaty restoring the alliance, and return to France victorious. The invasion will be difficult but manageable. The campaign begins in June 1812 when the Grand Army crosses the Niemen River into Russia. Almost immediately, problems emerge. Russia is vast, with poor roads and few cities. Supplying a massive army in this environment proves extremely difficult. The Russians retreat rather than offering battle, adopting a strategy that draws the French deeper into Russia while extending supply lines and exhausting troops through constant marching. Villages are burned as the Russians retreat, denying supplies to the advancing French. Heat, dust, disease, and hunger reduce the Grand Army before any major battle occurs. Napoleon advances on Moscow, expecting that capturing the ancient capital will force the Russians to negotiate. At Borodino in September, he finally fights the major battle he has sought. The battle is horrifically bloody, with enormous casualties on both sides, but tactically indecisive. The Russians retreat in good order. Napoleon continues to Moscow and occupies the city. But instead of capitulating, the Russians abandon Moscow. Fires break out, whether deliberately set or accidentally started in the chaos, and most of the city burns. Napoleon finds himself in control of a charred ruin, far from France, with winter approaching and no Russian surrender. You observe Napoleon waiting in Moscow for weeks, hoping the Tsar will negotiate. But Alexander refuses all communications. By mid-October, Napoleon recognizes that he must retreat before winter makes it impossible. The retreat from Moscow becomes a catastrophe. Winter arrives early and unusually cold. The army, already reduced by combat and disease, suffers terribly in freezing conditions. Food is scarce. Russian forces harry the retreating columns. Discipline collapses. Men abandon their units to search for food. Thousands freeze to death. Equipment is abandoned. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia, perhaps 100,000 return in fighting condition. The rest are dead, captured, or dispersed. The Russian disaster destroys the aura of Napoleonic invincibility. European states that accepted French dominance out of fear now see opportunity. Prussia defects from the French alliance and joins Russia. Austria maintains neutrality temporarily but prepares for eventual opposition. Sweden, led by Bernadotte, one of Napoleon's former marshals, joins the coalition against France. Britain continues to fund continental enemies and maintain pressure in Spain. By spring 1813, Napoleon faces the Sixth Coalition: Russia, Prussia, Britain, Spain, Portugal, and eventually Austria. Napoleon rebuilds the army with remarkable speed, conscripting new soldiers and equipping them with emergency production. He wins several battles in 1813, at Lutzen and Bautzen, demonstrating that his military skill remains formidable. But the strategic situation has changed. He now faces multiple armies converging from different directions. His satellite states begin to defect. Bavaria joins the coalition. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolves. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, called the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faces combined Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish forces and suffers a decisive defeat. He retreats across the Rhine into France. The empire beyond France's borders begins to collapse. You can see that Napoleon's response to defeat is to fight on, hoping that military success can restore the situation. But the coalition's resources vastly exceed France's. While Napoleon can still win individual battles through superior tactics, he cannot win the war. Coalition armies invade France from multiple directions. Napoleon conducts a brilliant defensive campaign in early 1814, defeating Allied detachments and attempting to drive the invaders back. But he is hopelessly outnumbered. Paris falls to coalition forces in March 1814. Napoleon's marshals and ministers, seeing the situation as hopeless, pressure him to abdicate. They fear that Napoleon's determination to fight to the end will result in France's destruction. The Senate, manipulated by Talleyrand, declares Napoleon deposed. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicates. He is exiled to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy, where he is given sovereignty and a pension. The Bourbon monarchy is restored in France under Louis XVIII, brother of the king executed in 1793. The revolutionary and Napoleonic period seems to have ended with restoration of the old regime. But Napoleon's personality and ambition cannot accept this ending. On Elba, he watches events in France carefully. The restored Bourbons prove unpopular. They are seen as foreign-imposed, too closely associated with the returning émigrés who demand restoration of their properties. Discontent spreads, particularly in the army, which is reduced in size and where many officers and soldiers feel betrayed. In March 1815, Napoleon escapes from Elba, lands in southern France, and marches toward Paris. Rather than arresting him, troops sent to stop him defect to his side. The slogan "From the Emperor to the General, from the General to the Soldier, from the Soldier to the Father" captures how rapidly he regained support. Louis XVIII flees as Napoleon approaches Paris. Napoleon enters the Tuileries Palace without firing a shot and resumes power. This begins the 100 Days, a brief period during which Napoleon attempts to rebuild his empire. He promises liberal reforms, adopts a more constitutional stance, attempts to negotiate with the European powers. But the coalition will not accept his return. They declare him an outlaw and mobilize armies to invade France again. Napoleon decides his only option is military victory. If he can defeat the coalition armies in detail before they unite, he might force a negotiated settlement. He marches north into Belgium where British and Prussian armies are gathering. At Waterloo on June 18, 1815, Napoleon attacks the British army under Wellington. The battle is close, but the arrival of Prussian reinforcements in the afternoon turns the tide. Napoleon's army is routed. He returns to Paris, abdicates again, and attempts to escape to America. British ships intercept him, and he surrenders to avoid capture by the Prussians, who might execute him. This time, the coalition takes no chances. Napoleon is exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, where escape is impossible. He will spend the remaining 6 years of his life there, writing memoirs, cultivating his legend, and reflecting on his rise and fall. He dies in 1821, probably of stomach cancer, though some suspected poisoning. His remains will eventually be returned to France and interred in Les Invalides in Paris, where they remain a site of pilgrimage. You step back now from the narrative of events to consider what Napoleon's career reveals about revolution, authority, and political order. The French Revolution began with the promise of replacing absolute monarchy with government based on popular sovereignty, natural rights, and constitutional limits. Yet within a decade, it produced the Terror, and within 15 years, it produced Napoleon's dictatorship. Within 25 years, it produced an empire more centralized and more autocratic than the Bourbon monarchy ever was. How did this transformation occur, and what does it tell us about revolutionary change? The pattern is not unique to France. Throughout history, revolutions that overthrow established authority often culminate in new forms of dictatorship. The English Revolution of the 17th century ended with Cromwell's military dictatorship before the monarchy was eventually restored. The Russian Revolution of 1917 led to Lenin's and then Stalin's totalitarian state. The pattern suggests something systemic rather than accidental. There seems to be an internal logic to revolutionary transformation that makes autocracy a likely outcome. One explanation focuses on the problem of legitimacy. Traditional authority, monarchy based on divine right, aristocracy based on hereditary status, commands obedience through the weight of custom and the assumption of natural hierarchy. When revolution destroys these traditional sources of legitimacy, it creates a vacuum. The revolutionaries claim to govern through popular sovereignty, but popular sovereignty is an abstract principle. How is the popular will determined? Who speaks for the people? When factions disagree, who decides? These questions have no clear answers, and the resulting uncertainty creates instability. Instability generates demand for order. When revolutionary governments cannot maintain stability, when faction fights faction, when the state seems unable to govern effectively, people begin to value order over participation. They become willing to accept authoritarian rule if it provides security, predictability, and effectiveness. This creates an opening for a strong leader who can claim to restore order while preserving revolutionary achievements. Napoleon perfectly embodies this role. He promises to complete the revolution by ending its chaos, to preserve its gains while eliminating its instability. You observe that Napoleon does preserve many revolutionary achievements. Legal equality survives under the empire. The abolition of feudalism is not reversed. Careers remain open to talent. The Civil Code, which embodies these principles, is Napoleon's lasting legacy. But political participation disappears. Constitutional limits vanish. Power concentrates in a single individual. The revolution's promise of popular sovereignty is reduced to managed plebiscites that ratify decisions already made. France becomes a dictatorship that claims revolutionary legitimacy while functioning as traditional autocracy. This suggests that revolutions face a fundamental dilemma. To defend themselves against counter-revolution, they need strong government and military power. But strong government and military power create their own logic, concentrating authority and marginalizing participation. The very forces that defend the revolution can subordinate it. The generals who defeat external enemies become potential internal rulers. The bureaucrats who administer revolutionary programs become a new elite. The revolution, which began by attacking privilege and arbitrary power, creates new forms of privilege and new concentrations of power. Napoleon's career also illustrates how individual ability interacts with historical circumstances. Without Napoleon's extraordinary talents, his military genius, his administrative skill, his political cunning, his capacity for work, the specific form French authoritarianism took would have been different. Another general might have seized power but governed less effectively or pursued different policies. Yet the general trajectory, from revolutionary instability to military dictatorship, seems likely regardless of individual identity. The circumstances created the opportunity, Napoleon exploited it brilliantly, but someone would have exploited it. The empire's ultimate failure suggests limits to authoritarian power, no matter how skillfully wielded. Napoleon could conquer territory and impose his will through force. He could create administrative systems and legal codes. He could win battles and redraw maps. But he could not create lasting consent. The people he conquered resented subordination. The allies he forced into submission defected when opportunity arose. The soldiers he conscripted fought effectively when winning but melted away when defeated. Power based primarily on military force and personal prestige cannot survive indefinitely because it depends on continued success and cannot outlast its creator. You consider what alternatives might have existed. Could the revolution have consolidated a stable republic without passing through dictatorship? France tried multiple republican constitutions, the Constitution of 1791, the Constitution of 1793, the Constitution of Year 3. All failed to create stable government. Perhaps republican government requires certain preconditions: widespread education, experience with self-government, broad consensus on fundamental values, that revolutionary France lacked. Perhaps the external threat from hostile monarchies made stable civilian government impossible. Perhaps the revolution's social radicalism created divisions too deep for constitutional mechanisms to manage. Or perhaps the revolutionary cycle is not inevitable but rather reflects choices made by historical actors. The terror was not predetermined, it resulted from specific decisions by specific individuals. Napoleon's coup was not inevitable, the Directory might have survived or been replaced differently. The transformation from republic to empire involved many moments where different paths were possible. Yet in retrospect, the path taken seems logical, almost necessary, because we know what succeeded and can see how each step led to the next. The Napoleonic legacy is complex. Napoleon spread revolutionary principles across Europe: legal equality, abolition of feudalism, careers open to talent. He modernized administration, rationalized law, and broke down medieval structures. Many Europeans welcomed these changes and later defended them against restoration attempts. The Napoleonic codes influenced legal development across Europe and Latin America. In this sense, Napoleon was a revolutionary who extended the revolution's reach beyond France and beyond its initial intentions. Yet Napoleon also betrayed the revolution's promise of popular sovereignty and constitutional government. He transformed a republic into a dictatorship and then an empire. He subordinated political freedom to administrative efficiency and military glory. He created a police state that suppressed opposition and managed public opinion. He led France into constant warfare that eventually exhausted the country and led to catastrophic defeat. The human cost of the Napoleonic Wars, millions dead, economies disrupted, societies traumatized, was immense. As you reflect on Napoleon's career from revolution to empire, you recognize that it reveals fundamental tensions in modern politics. The desire for popular government conflicts with the need for effective authority. The promise of political participation conflicts with the demand for stability. The revolution's ideals confront the harsh realities of power, resistance, and human nature. Napoleon resolved these tensions by subordinating ideals to authority, participation to effectiveness, freedom to order. This resolution was successful in narrow terms. He governed France effectively for 15 years, dominated Europe for a decade. But it was ultimately unstable because it depended on one man's ability and on continued military success. The restoration that followed Napoleon's fall did not return Europe to the pre-revolutionary status quo. Too much had changed. The ideas released by the revolution could not be suppressed. The administrative and legal reforms Napoleon instituted could not be entirely reversed. The experience of mass politics, even manipulated politics, could not be erased. Post-Napoleonic Europe would be shaped by the tension between restored monarchies and revolutionary memories, between conservative reaction and liberal nationalism, between the desire for order and the demand for freedom. Napoleon himself, dying on St. Helena, cultivated a legend that emphasized his revolutionary credentials and minimized his authoritarianism. He presented himself as the victim of reactionary monarchies who feared the principles he represented. This Napoleonic legend would influence European politics throughout the 19th century, inspiring both nationalist movements and authoritarian rulers who claimed to embody popular will while concentrating power. The pattern Napoleon established, revolution leading to strong leadership claiming revolutionary legitimacy while exercising authoritarian control, would recur repeatedly. You stand at the end of this long examination, understanding that Napoleon's transformation from revolutionary general to emperor illustrates how revolutions can recreate the very authority they overthrow. The forms change, there is no divine right, no inherited nobility, no medieval hierarchy. But the substance returns: concentrated power, limited dissent, subordination of individual freedom to state purposes. Whether this pattern is inevitable, whether alternatives existed, whether different choices could have produced different outcomes, these questions remain debated. What is clear is that the revolutionary promise of government based on popular consent and constitutional limits proved extraordinarily difficult to achieve, and that the search for stability led to acceptance of autocracy under new justifications. The revolution devoured itself, not through terror but through the embrace of a strong leader who promised to preserve its achievements while ending its uncertainties. In Napoleon, France found order and glory. It also found dictatorship and eventual catastrophe, demonstrating once again that political transformation rarely produces the outcomes its initiators intended.